Good morning. Happy last day of summer series. As you might be able to tell from the height of the platform, I will not be teaching this morning. But my good friend Walter will be. Walter has been around DCC for a few years now. As he was finishing up his doctorate in spiritual formation, he spent some time with our community looking at questions around belonging. And I got the pleasure of meeting Walter on my very first day as the spiritual formation pastor. And we have been good friends since. I have learned a lot from him, been inspired by his beautiful brain. Walter's one of the smartest people I think I've ever met, no pressure. And just a deep fount of wisdom. So I am really excited that he is going to be teaching us this morning and that we have the opportunity to learn from him. So I will get out of the way and Walter can bring us the word.
Awesome. Thank you. No pressure. Being the smartest person she's ever met. I don't believe that at all. Well, good morning. My name is Dr. Walter Wilson, so I guess there must be some intelligence there. It's weird to say that out loud, Dr. Wilson. But this is my first time preaching here at Denver Community Church, and I'm just so deeply grateful to be here. And I also want to be really honest with you right from the front. There's a particular kind of anxiety that comes with returning to something that you thought you had lost. Especially when that something is your vocation or your voice or your theological self. Standing here today, I feel all that anxiety in my body. Not because I'm unprepared. I've been preparing for this my entire adult life. I grew up in a Bible-loving church with a family in the evangelical church. I studied physics in my undergrad while serving in churches and parachurch ministries. I was mentored in those spaces as I pursued missions work in Asia and served in the military. Eventually, I even earned a master's in spiritual formation and my doctorate in ethics and theology. I got to study in schools across the United States, the UK, and Australia. By every measure, externally, I was formed for ministry. And yet for years, I felt like someone who was formed for something I was no longer allowed to do. Not because anyone said it directly, there was no grand confrontation, just a quiet cultural drift, invitations that never came, smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes, a gentle but firm distancing. I was never explicitly rejected, I quietly just disappeared. Not fully silenced, but no longer included. At the time, I didn't call it grief. I called it a new season. I called it redirecting, but it really was grief. And beneath the grief was silence, and under the silence, loneliness and isolation. A slow erasure of the story I thought I was living. Eventually, I realized I wasn't living a transition. I was living in exile. It wasn't geographic. It was vocational and spiritual. A dislocation of congruence and calling, a fracture between preparation and possibility. I'd been shaped for ministry and then asked gently to set apart that side of myself. In the Hebrew Bible, exile is never just about location, it's about the loss of meaning. In Israel's imagination, exile meant being cut off, not only from your land, but your temple, your rhythms, your rituals. Exile unthreads our ability to belong. Even the memory of being known becomes hard to hold. That's what made the invitations to preach and minister again so disorienting for me. But they continued, and one pastor in particular, Hannah, Enneagram 8, saw something in me I stopped seeing in myself. She didn't let me disappear into my professional life. She didn't let me substitute my busyness for embodiment. She made space for my wilderness to still mean something, to still speak. When Hannah reached out asking me to preach from Deuteronomy, I found myself naming the theme, Becoming in the Wilderness. It sounded safe, theological even, But it wasn't abstract enough. It felt a little too true. The moment I said it, I knew I was naming more than a passage. I was naming my own return. In a quiet and persistent way, Hannah and some other people in this room weren't just asking me to teach. You were asking me to come out of exile. You were offering something I wasn't sure I still had permission to want. My first feeling was not joy. It was fear. The kind that shows up as avoidance, as ambiguity. I buried myself in my day job. I stayed busy. I kept my head down. I'm really quite good at that. But beneath all of it was a question I hadn't let myself ask. Could I return? And if I did, who would I be? And so I said yes, not because I was certain, but because I was willing. Because return is often not a triumph. It's a trembling. It's a stepping through a threshold that once seemed sealed shut, not by rusted hinges, but by internal stories. Stories told to you, about you, and eventually stories that you tell yourself. That's why Deuteronomy feels so personal to me today, because this book, this collection of memory, law, lament, and love, is not delivered from the mountain or the city. It's delivered from the edge, from the wilderness, from the sacred in-between place where everything has changed and nothing is certain. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years. Deuteronomy 8:12. That's Moses speaking to a people who spent an entire generation in transition. The land is before them, but they're not there yet. They're no longer enslaved, but not yet settled. They've been fed with manna, led by fire, held by God, and still they are a people in formation. In ancient Near Eastern imagination, wilderness isn't just emptiness, it's education. It's the space between deliverance and arrival where your identity is tested, forged, and reformed. This is where prophets hear God in the silence, where kings are broken, where idols are named and dismantled, where people learn, often painfully, that deliverance is not the same thing as arriving. That's the thread we're picking up from Paula's sermon last week. She reflected on the story of Moses and on our own wilderness experiences as disorientation, as holy ground. Today we're going to carry that forward, not just into theology, but into narrative and into memory. You might remember what came before, or you might not, and if you don't, that's okay. The story of Moses and the Israelites begins in bondage. Israel is enslaved in Egypt for generations, forced into hard labor, under a regime that feared them. They are not yet a people with land or law, just descendants of Abraham, living as outsiders in a nation that does not want them. God hears their cries. Moses, a Hebrew, raised in Pharaoh's palace and exiled after an act of violence, is called back into the story through a burning bush and a hesitant yes. He returns to Egypt with a stutter and a staff, and with God's insistence that Pharaoh let the people go. What follows are miracles and resistance, 10 plagues, a hardened heart, and finally a dramatic deliverance. The Red Sea parts, and the people of Israel walk through on dry land. Their oppressors are swallowed behind them. But liberation is not arrival. They didn't step into stability, they stepped into the wilderness. Instead of going straight into the promised land, they wander for 40 years. An entire generation dies in that transition. The people struggle with trust, with leadership, and with memory. They are fed with manna, guided by fire, tested, grieved, and remade. And I think it's important to name this. Most of what we know as Israel's formation happens not in the promised land, but in the wilderness. Before they ever plant a vineyard, before they build a temple, they learn what it means to be a people who are carried and supported. They receive the law, they learn the festivals, they build the tabernacle. They had to unlearn Egypt before they could begin to understand covenant. So as we enter into Deuteronomy, we're not at the beginning of the story today. We're at the edge. the edge of the land we've been promised, the edge of memory and of hope. And Moses, who had led them this far, doesn't enter the land. But before he goes, he tells the story again, not just to recount it, but to interpret it, to remind them who they are and to invite them to choose again the people that they want to become. Theologically, Deuteronomy offers a post-exilic editorial voice, very fancy. Scholars suggest the final form of the text was shaped during or after the Babylon exile, a moment when Israel had lost the temple, the land, and any illusion of divine entitlement. The law in Deuteronomy is no longer about triumph. It's about memory, humility, and ethical imagination. Deuteronomy is a retelling at the edge of something new. Moses walks the people back through every word, not to rehash shame, but to clarify who they became in the process. The wilderness was not a detour, it was formation, a slow, sacred shaping between bondage and belovedness. It's Moses saying, let me tell you who we've been, so you can decide who you'll become. And that's where I find myself too today. Not as someone who's arrived, but as someone who's standing on the edge, someone returning from silence, someone trying to listen to memory, to grace, to God. I'm still becoming, I'm still remembering, and I'm still being remembered. There you saw how the Lord your God carried you as a man carries his son. Deuteronomy 1:31. Theologically, wilderness is not a narrative filler in the biblical story. It's a defining theological motif. In the Hebrew Bible, wilderness is both physical and symbolic. It is a space between what was and what might yet be. It's a crucible of dependence, a landscape of disorientation, and paradoxically, the very same place where intimacy with God is made possible through the stripping away of false securities. Moses opens Deuteronomy not with celebration, but with memory, not with strategy, but with a story. And not to shame Israel, but to situate them. He walks the people back through the rebellion, wandering, divine provision, and painful delay. His retelling is not punitive, it's really a preparation. But before they can become a people of promise, they have to remember how they were shaped in the wilderness. As we named earlier, wilderness in the ancient Near Eastern imagination was not simply a space of absence. It was where identity was negotiated, where kings were tested, prophets were called, and idols undone. It is the limited terrain between deliverance and destiny, and it is where the shape of a people began to emerge. When I reflect on my own wilderness, I don't first think of deserts, and I don't think of silence. I really think of fragmentation. My wilderness was very internal. It looked like vocational displacement and spiritual exhaustion. It sounded like silence from spaces where I once spoke freely. It felt like walking through a dense forest with no map, only my memory. I spent years preparing for life in ministry, missions, theological education, ethical leadership. I was convinced I was going to live in Asia and serve as a missionary. I was going to blend community development, business, and spiritual formation. I imagined a future where calling and my identity would clearly align. But when I came out, that life completely disappeared. There was no scandal, but there was a lot of silence. With shrinking invitations, with the unspoken understanding that who I was disqualified me from who I believed I was called to be. I didn't grieve it immediately. I worked, I served in the Air Force, I succeeded, I built a business, I wrote a book. I told myself I was just on a new path. But beneath that productivity was a quiet ache, a ghost of a theologian I thought I was becoming. And yet, it was that precise dislocation that something deeper began to take place for me. I started to notice that scattered parts of myself. It was like my childhood, my military experience, my faith, my doubts. Each one was just laying fragmented across the forest floor. They weren't discarded per se, just waiting. And over time, I saw the wilderness wasn't destroying me, the wilderness was naming me. Slowly, honestly. as if God was helping me gather the pieces across the floor into the man I was supposed to be. Someone more whole, someone more honest, and someone more loved. This is really what Deuteronomy insists. The wilderness is not a void, it's a place of formation. There you saw how the Lord your God carried you. This is not language of merit. It's the language of mercy. God carries, not because we earn it, but because wilderness doesn't require perfection. It invites trust. In theological terms, the wilderness operates as counter-liturgy. It deconstructs idolatry of triumph, certainty, and clarity. It asks us to instead walk with God in the tension and the questions, in the not yet knowing. And perhaps this is where the deepest faith is formed. Not in what we accomplish, but in what we survive. Not in how clearly we see our path, but in how we learn to walk without a map. We have to learn to trust the voice that says, even here, I will carry you. If the wilderness is where identity is stripped down, Deuteronomy 6 is where it is reoriented. So after walking the Israelites back through their failures and formation, Moses pivots to what may be the most foundational theological claim in the Hebrew scriptures, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. Deuteronomy 6, 4 and 5. The Shema is not merely a creed. It is a reframing of the covenant, a daily liturgy, a spiritual muscle memory. In ancient Israel, it was recited every morning and every evening. It was written on doorposts, tied to forearms, whispered over children. It was etched into the rhythms of ordinary life. But this isn't just devotional repetition, it's survival theology. The Shema was how you carried covenant forward, not abstractly, but through the body. It was how you remembered who you were, not in prosperity, but in exile, not in the promised land, but while you're waiting. What strikes me most about the Shema is not just its insistence on love, but its demand for wholeness. Heart, soul, strength. That's not segmented love. It's total. It asks for the integrated self, everything together. The honest self, the unfragmented offering of people who know what it means to be carried. But I ask myself, what happens when we don't believe we're lovable? In my own wilderness, I found myself defaulting not to love, but to performance. When the structures around me no longer made space for my full self, I reached for control, for framework, and for behavior. I served in ministry that taught spiritual growth through 5 core habits: scripture, prayer, fellowship, witness, and keeping Christ at the center. There's nothing inherently wrong with those practices, but for me, they became a transaction, a way to earn a sense of spiritual legitimacy in a world that increasingly treated my existence as suspect. If I just prayed enough, volunteered enough, stayed quiet about the hard stuff, maybe I'd still belong to the church. But then suddenly the framework just collapsed for me. It didn't make sense. At first, I tried to hold it all together, the structure of discipleship I'd been handed, the belief that obedience would lead to belonging. But somewhere in the rhythm of military and ministry service, a crack formed. I started to feel disconnected between the values I lived every day in my military work, discipline, integrity, collective purpose, and the values I heard echoed in church spaces, integrity, spiritual worthiness, and doctrinal performance, a kind of purity that felt impossibly distant. One space measured my effort, the other space was my acceptability. Eventually, the weight of all the dissonance became too much for me. The ministry, the metrics, the sense of certainty, it all gave way. I remember sitting alone on a military base in Korea, asking God a question that scared me. If I never serve in ministry again, if I never wear the title missionary, if all I ever do is serve in silence, Is that a life worth living? The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense. It was charged, and in it I heard no answers, only presence. A presence that did not require performance, a love that didn't require any proof. In covenant theology, that's what distinguishes Israel's God from the gods of surrounding nations. The covenant is not a contract. It's not transactional. It is relational. It's a commitment to mutual belonging. St. Thomas Aquinas, centuries later, would write, "Now the end of every law is to make men righteous and virtuous. The old law could not accomplish this, but foreshadowed it. The new law fulfills the old by justifying men through the power of Christ's passion." Even Aquinas, rooted in a scholastic framework, understood that what Moses was getting at. The law was never the end. The law was a mirror. It was a guide, a tether to the God who first loved us. So when Moses tells Israel to love God with all their heart, soul, and strength, he is not prescribing perfection. He's inviting presence. He is saying, bring your whole self. Yes, even the disoriented, disqualified, ugly parts, and love from there. Because that is what covenant has always been. It's not a rule book, it's a relationship. He brought us out from there to bring us in. Deuteronomy 6:23. We were brought out of bondage, we were brought into belonging through love. And that is the invitation that that's the invitation that remains for us, not to be perfect or spiritually perform, but to live as people already claimed, already carried, and already loved. And as those who are already loved, we are called to remember this foundational reality, not as a sentiment, but actually as an ethic. Because in the story of Deuteronomy, memory is not a passive concept. It's the grounds for identity, the basis of belonging, and the map we use to shape our future. You are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourself were foreigners in Egypt. Deuteronomy 10:19. Memory in Deuteronomy is not a mere reflection, it's resistance. It's a spiritual act with political consequence. Moses, near the end of his address to Israel, draws the people back, not just to what happened, but to who they were. They were strangers, sojourners, enslaved. And then he does something theologically pretty radical. He makes memory an ethic. He turns it outward. He says, you are to love the stranger because you were once strangers. This is not nostalgia. This is covenant imagination. Israel's identity is never rooted in triumph. Israel's identity is always rooted in survival. And in that survival is a demand. Remember what it was like when the world did not make room for you, and then become the kind of people who make room. But remembering, as I've come to learn, is not easy, especially when the promised land you stepped into doesn't look like milk and honey, but like a room where you finally feel safe, a gathering where you are no longer a theological problem, a moment where the full weight of who you are is not just tolerated, but welcomed. I remember the first time I experienced this kind of space. I was at a conference for LGBTQ plus Christians, a space where queer theology wasn't whispered but proclaimed, where worship didn't shrink around us, but expanded because we were there, where people like me preached and prayed and led, and not from the margins, but right here from the center. It felt like a dream, almost a glitch in the system. For years, I navigated rooms where my voice was either silenced or spiritualized into usefulness. But here I was just seen. One of my friends, after a few sessions, turned to me and said, just hearing a queer person preach, it's changing how I see everything. That memory lives in me, not as proof, but as promise. Not as look how far we've come, but as a reminder that the promised land is never a destination. It's a posture, it's a way of being in the world. We are shaped by who and what we remember. And that is where Western theology often goes astray. We've inherited some frameworks that turn the promised land into an afterlife reward. It's something we reach after we've done everything we can with this world. It's a framework that strips it of political substance and reduces it to a personal paradise. Frameworks that imagine heaven as escape, not as restoration or redemption. New Testament scholar N.T. Wright critiques this drift as a form of residual Platonism, a belief that the physical world is corrupt and heaven is a disembodied elsewhere. He writes, "The roots of the misunderstanding go very deep. People have supposed that Christians are meant to devalue the present world and our present bodies and regard them as shabby or shameful. But that is not the vision of Deuteronomy, and it's not the vision of Jesus. The promised land was not a reward, it was a responsibility. It was where justice had to be built, where memory had to be institutionalized, where worship had to include the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. And if we, here and now, imagine ourselves as people who have, in some sense, arrived, the question becomes, what do we do with our memory of exile? Do we use it to protect our comfort, or do we let it shape our ethic? A church that remembers exile is not a church that hoards safety. It is a church that opens its doors wider, that refuses to weaponize belonging, that protects the wounded, that tells the truth, even when it's costly. It's a church that makes space for people still in process, just like me. As N.T. Wright reminds us, the church is called not to wait for heaven, but to embody it. He writes, the church that is working for justice, beauty, and evangelism is not distracting from the kingdom. It is participating in its arrival. Here, evangelism is not conversion. It's a public demonstration that God's new creation has already begun. According to Wright, this kind of evangelism is rooted in justice, beauty, and hope. It's an act of renewal in our work, our relationships, and our inner life. In that sense, the promised land is never finished. It is always being remembered, and it's always being remade. And so the question remains, what kind of people will become, not once we arrive, but once we realize we've been given power again? Because memory, when shaped by exile, will either form us into the architects of welcome or agents of forgetting. Because to remember rightly is to become differently. And this is where Deuteronomy unsettles us the most. There is no final destination in this story. There's no spiritual arrival point where formation ends. There's only a path forward shaped by memory and held in community. Israel is not simply being led to a place. They are being led into a future, a becoming that demands continual choice, humility, and transformation. And so the tone shifts quietly and unmistakably. There's a shift in tone that happens late in the book, in Deuteronomy. It's quiet but unmistakable. After chapters of memory and formation and reflection, Moses turns towards the future, not with strategy or plans, but with a choice. See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. Deuteronomy 11:26. For me, this is a haunting line, not because it threatens, but because it names what we already suspect, that we are always becoming. That what happens next, individually, communally, it depends in part on what we carry and what we leave behind. Blessing and curse. In this context, aren't punishments or prizes, they're patterns. They're what unfold when people align, or rather fail to align, with justice, mercy, and covenantal memory. Blessing is not ease, it's integrity. It is congruence with the character of God. And curse, not divine vengeance, but disintegration. It's forgetting, a slow unmaking of the very things that once carried us. What is unnerving is how ordinary those choices tend to be. It's not a dramatic fork in the road. It's whether I speak honestly when it's uncomfortable, whether I create room for someone else's story when it disrupts my own, whether I make peace with what I've lost or let that loss calcify into bitterness. I still find myself choosing safety over presence more than I'd like to admit. I still reach for silence when vulnerability asks to speak. And there are days when I'm not sure if I'm building something or if I'm just surviving it. And yet the invitation keeps returning. Choose life. Choose it again, in this breath, in this moment, even now. But Moses isn't speaking just to one person. He's speaking to an entire people. That's where this section of the story changes shape. It becomes communal. It's political and it's structural. The question isn't just who are you becoming, it is what kind of people are we becoming together? Because wilderness does something to us. It clarifies and it fragments. It teaches and it wounds. And when the wandering ends or begins to end, the question becomes not whether we will have power again, but what we will do with it once we have it. That's what Moses is preparing Israel for, not just arrival, but responsibility. He knows the temptation of arrival. He knows how easily memory can erode once we're no longer hungry. He knows that power, or even hard-won power, can cause us to quickly forget its own origin story. So Moses says, remember. Remember who you were in Egypt. Remember what it felt like to be unseen. Remember the wilderness, not to idolize the pain, but to honor the formation of being lost. And let that memory shape what you build next. It's easy to imagine we'd all remember that our suffering would naturally produce empathy, but history tells us otherwise. We know how quickly trauma can mutate into tribalism, how easily theology can become a gate. How many churches were born out of resistance and became protectors of the very things that they once opposed? So I find myself wondering quietly and often, what kind of church forgets? And more painfully, what kind of church remembers? Not in theory, but in its policies and its practices, its posture towards those who are still in exile. I don't think these are easy questions. And maybe they're not meant to be. Maybe they are meant to stay with us. Not as burdens, but as companions. As gentle tugs on the conscience. As invitations to choose again and again what is sacred over what is safe. We are not yet who we will be, and that is, in itself, an act of grace. Hannah will finish the sermon today with a benediction, but as we transition, I would like to leave you with a benediction for this sermon. And so as you move forward from these words back into your world, not into resolution, but into rhythm, may you carry this with you. That you are still becoming, that memory is a form of faithfulness, that forgetting is easier than we think, that choosing life doesn't always look triumphant. Sometimes it looks like telling the truth quietly. Sometimes it looks like staying when leaving would be simpler. Sometimes it looks like making space at the table for someone whose story disrupts your own. You are not where you started, and you are not yet where you're going. But even here, even now, God is not waiting for you on the other side. God is walking with you in the uncertainty, sitting beside you in the silence, grieving with you in the loss, holding your questions without rushing to answers. So go with tenderness towards yourself, towards others, towards the community you're still learning how to build. May your theology make room for mystery. May your memory make room for mercy. May your architecture make room for people who are still in process, including yourself. And may the wilderness you've walked become the soil of compassion for someone else's story. Choose life, not all at once, but slowly, breath by breath, moment by moment, and do it together. Amen.
As we come to prepare to participate in the Eucharist together. What a beautiful word, to just remember. Each week when we participate in Eucharist, we do have this moment to pause and to remember the Passover, and also to remember Jesus and his Last Supper with his own disciples. One of the rhythms of Christianity is this constant call to remember where you have been as you look forward to where you are going. So today, as we reflect on Jesus' words, I want to invite you to just remember where you fit in this much bigger Christian story, but also what that journey has looked like for each of you in this room. I'll remind you that as we participate in Eucharist, we practice what is called open table communion here. What that means is if you're in this room, we invite you to join us. There's not any qualifications for participating in this meal with us, just that you feel the tug, that you want to participate in this table with us. So as we reflect on Jesus' words, I invite you to come as you are led. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Come as you are led.